Okay, I'm bringing a different kind of psychology to you today. I am not a consumer psychologist, I am a psychotherapist, so my specialty is actually in the one-to-one and understanding what's going on the psychodynamic level. So that's looking at stuff that's going on unconsciously and usually with individuals rather than groups of people. But I'm going to start off with a little bit of an exercise like my type like to do, and I'm going to throw this out into the audience and ask you to reflect on what was the last book that you read or the most current book that you're reading. I'm going to throw it out and scream it out and then pass the ball. We'll do about 5 people. Oops. Heads up. Okay, what was the last thing you read on the Kindle?
A book called Big Machine. It was fiction.
Okay, pass it along. On AdWords. Okay. AdWords. Okay, pass along.
Well, I am going to be reading a book on your customer creation equation.
Okay. Let's go for about 2 more. Sorry? Okay, you all gave very good answers. So I didn't hear any 50 Shades of Grey. I'm curious about what people thought when I asked that question, which is what book did I actually read and what book I'm going to say I actually read. And what you said you actually read fits the context for today, doesn't it? So welcome to the world of social networking. Yeah, we have an answer and then we make an answer as well. Okay, so what you see is what you get. Not really. What you get is not what you see, because what you get is a much bigger picture than what you actually see. It's not the book you've read and told us you read, it's about the book you read and didn't tell us that you read. At least for the psychoanalyst it is. Okay, oops. Can we go back? There we go. Oh, see, psychoanalysts are notoriously bad at clickers. So for Freud, and I'm pleased I'm not the first person to say his name here tonight, saying Freud in a group like this is like one of your people coming to my people and saying SEO, and you'll have a room full of sort of googly eyes. He talked about dream interpretation, in which he made a distinction between manifest content and latent content. Manifest content is the dream, and the latent content is the meaning of the dream. So the manifest content is what we allow ourselves to see through a whole series of sort of things that are going on in our minds, and the latent is the stuff that's really, really happening. Now today we understand this a little bit differently, and we call it content and process. So content is the stuff that's on the surface, process is the stuff that's going on underneath. Now what happens is content takes up about this much of what's going on, and process takes up about this much of what's going on. Now, if I'm speaking too fast for you, it was suggested that I make this presentation go quite quickly, so I hope you can keep up. If you can't, there's some of this stuff up on my blog. Okay, so, I've done it again. So I think about the online world as an extension of self, which is why I think that you can take the theories that come from the depth psychologies, which are sort of modern iterations of psychoanalysis, not just the old stuff, to understand what people are doing online. Because what people are doing online is they're extending themselves outwards into the digital world, and they're using the same psychology out there, but the digital world kind of dictates what kind of psychology is enabled and what kind is disabled. So when we think about our extensions, we think about technology, which enables the extension into the world, and the architecture of that technology says how that extension is going to work. The psychology, which is the paradigm through which we can understand the extensions that are going on out there in the world. The motivation, which is a really important one, which is derived from the unconscious, which I'll be talking about, but played out through consciousness. So the motivation largely comes from process and gets played out in that little bit called content. Online interaction largely appeals to the outward performing aspects of the ego, and I'll go into that language a little bit later, but it's like what we were doing in the room before, that you're going to share something here because you're in an outward expression of yourself in a certain environment, and your ego kind of wants everybody in the room to know that you're reading something about online marketing and that you're not reading 50 Shades of Grey, for example. And persuasion. both intrasubjective, and this is really important, and intersubjective. So intrasubjective is what we're doing inside our own minds, and intersubjective is what we're doing between minds together. And we're doing both jobs. So we're making intrasubjective decisions between our egos and our superegos and our ids and that sort of thing, and also trying to understand what's going on between people. Lots of stuff. I mean, this is mostly about social networking, but it can work through lots of different ways online. Okay, so it is the psychology stupid. We actually can use old-fashioned psychology, too, to understand some of the stuff that's going on online. So the internal world is comprised of relationships, and that's about how I see myself and how you see me, and how they meet each other. Where is the thing? Freud's tripartite psyche is still helpful, okay? You won't find it in an fMRI. I'm not going to say it's scientifically validatable, but it is a way in which we can think about things that actually works. It's a conceptual system, so bear with me for thinking conceptually about ourselves in the sense of the id being the place where our passions, unconscious aggressions are, that sort of thing. Our ego, which is the thing that mediates the internal world and the external world, and our superego, which tells us what to do and then tells us that we haven't done it well enough. The ego sits between the id and the superego and the internal world and the external world. And what we talk about when we are expressing ourselves online is almost always ego, and it's almost always that bit of the ego that is looking outwards, not the bit that's looking inwards. And there's lots of consequences for that. Online interaction is the domain of the ego, yet it's dictated by unconscious relational forces. And what I mean by relational is back to this intersubjective stuff. So for Freud, it was all about sex. We've kind of updated that now. We know it's about attachment and motivation to relate to others, and that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. Okay, so the relational psyche. The key to ego fulfillment is the recognition of the other. This is like our most basic need. And actually the formation of the ego, because when babies come into the world, they don't actually have a cohesive, integrated ego. It comes in relation to the gaze of the mother's eyes, the attuned mother's relationship to that baby, how she's speaking to the baby, body language, the warmth of her skin, taking integrated experience like hunger or gas or being cold or being wet, and kind of, in a sense, metabolizing that for the baby and feeding back. And this whole process creates an ego. And what's working there is recognition, that the mother recognizes the baby's experience in the world. I will relate this to online stuff in just a second, but the developmental key is super important. So to recognize, as one of the great current psychoanalysts has said, is to affirm, to validate, acknowledge, know, accept, understand, empathize, take in, tolerate, appreciate, see, identify with, find familiar, and to love. Now, usually what I would like to do is ask you to reflect on these verbs here for a second and see how you give and take all of these different things and what kind of complex psychological operation is going on there. We don't have time to do that today, but you can kind of get this is a complex task, which in our current social world we have whittled down to a very simple task, which is the like button on Facebook. Now, like is a deployment of recognition, so it's actually super important because we need recognition more than we need anything else, and we need authentic recognition more than anything else. If we get inauthentic recognition, it doesn't work for us. We seek a lot of inauthentic recognition, and that's another story, but we're looking for the authentic stuff. Now, there's lots of ways in which recognition is deployed over social networks, shares, comments, and these vary in complexity between wide and narrow. Upvotes on something like Reddit, retweets, follows, reblogging, and posting. So what we have here is developing an economy, not the one that we're usually used to, but an economy of recognition. That when I get recognized, I get points. And these points are ego points. So as I was saying before, the internet and social networking in particular is an extension of these basic psychological aspects of ourselves. So in the real world, we have a self-to-self interaction. And then we have the ego, which is, there's some water down here. We have the ego, which is sort of mitigating that, or mediating the two self-to-self interaction. Underneath, we have the unconscious, which is this relational thing. This is very unsexy, isn't it? Trying to pour myself some water up here. Okay, so the unconscious is filtering up through the selves, and it's negotiated by the egos. So when the thing that's going on in the unconscious, as I'm theorizing it, is this desire to relate to others, the desire to be seen by others, the desire to see others, and the same for the self. So we want to deploy recognition and we want to get recognition. Then we have online interaction, usually across social networks, which, thank you so much, which the ego is extending through. So if we take one side of this little model here, we're doing ego through the online world. And for all of you who are doing marketing, this is really super important because what you're not necessarily doing is selling a product, but you're selling an identification to an ego. We have our self here, online presence in what I call the outward lean. So what happens is the outward-facing part of the ego starts to expand and grow in relation to an online life, because what online life is asking you to do is hoik parts of yourselves online so that other people can see it, recognize it, so that you can identify not really your whole self, but generally how you idealize yourself to be or to like. And so there's a mirror image of what other people are expecting from you and from your outward-facing ego. So Facebook, in a sense, is probably one of the best representations of outward-facing ego. Still a part of the self, but it calls upon a very particular kind of expression of the self, which is ego self. And I also kind of want to say this is not necessarily ego like he or she has a big ego. It's not about narcissism. It's about a basic function of the psyche, which is that bit mediating inner world and outer world, but performing itself in the outer world. So what is the apotheosis of the outward-facing self online? You got it. So this is like really an exemplar of the selfie. So this is a representation of self that is hoisted outwards into the world and says, look, this is how I wish to be perceived right now. And on top of that, I wish to be perceived in a way that you're going to share this picture or like this picture or that it will get some traction. Because if you put that picture out there and it goes nowhere, there's really there's nothing to be gained. There are no ego points in it. So, persuading ourselves, this is a big ego function. This comes from Fight Club. We buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like. What is that about? Okay, that is about ego. That is about trying to gain recognition in a particular kind of a way that's funneled through a particular kind of a system that has signs of recognition. So obviously, brands. Now, this guy is C.G. Jung. We're talking about persona here, which is a different kind of persona that we were talking about earlier. He talked about this really clearly in a way that I find really helpful. Jung says that the persona is a kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression on others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. So we all need a persona. We need a way of engaging in the public world, but it's not the whole picture. And Jung also says, the persona is not a bad thing, it's not pathological, but if we identify with that persona as being the whole thing, then we're in a little bit of trouble. If you want to sell somebody something, or if you want to get them to give money to a charity or support a certain kind of a cause, you've got to look at how this works through the persona and dig down to these underlying causes about recognition. So we have some problems with altruism on this sort of thing about displaying when you've given to charity. Is this about enhancing your persona, or is this about a more altruistic need? It's a little bit of both, but what people tend to do is tend to sell to egos and personas without sort of necessarily understanding what's going on underneath and feeding those ego desires. This is Donald Winnicott, very famous British psychoanalyst, who had another word for this called the false self. It's a bit of a misnomer because it is still a real self, but it's just part of the self. Again, the performing part of the self. The false self is set up to protect the true self, to respond to challenges in the environment. The false self essentially takes up the role of social compliance. Again, we see this really clearly, usually on social networks in which you can be identified, so it doesn't work as well on anonymous social networks. But an example I like to give is if you, in your Facebook cohort, like a certain kind of music or like to read articles from a certain kind of newspaper, you're unlikely to share music across that social network that those people are going to think you're kind of crummy for wanting to listen to or reading from that newspaper. So again, we have this content part and this process part and looking at the decisions people are making about what to post. So mostly in a sense here, I'm talking about what people are buying and posting online, so using social and merchandising, not necessarily something that's, well, private between oneself and the whole marketing world rather than private between oneself and their friends. Okay, so appealing to the self means more than appealing to one person. You've got to appeal to all of these bits. So we've got to appeal to the selfish bits and the aggressive bits. We've got to appeal to the bit that wants to show up good, and then we've got to appeal to the bits that have higher expectations for the other bits. People are complex beasts. Fundamentally, we are appealing to this desire to show up in the eyes of others in a particular kind of a way, to be liked. This is why the like picture comes out. Now, people have a bizarre panoply of ways of attracting kind of their version of like, because it might be by being an internet troll. You're still attracting a kind of attention, you're still attracting a kind of recognition, but it's a particular kind of recognition. Again, that's aided and abetted by the various social networks that we're talking about. So if we have a series of sort of objects out there in the world that people might be interested in identifying themselves with, each of these things give us a different kind of feeling. And each of these things give us a different kind of a feeling because they appeal to different aspects of our psyche. So if we take Freud's old model and we think about our superego, we think about our ego, and we think about our id, we kind of end up having a variance of different things that appeal to those various aspects of those psychic types. So for example, our superego is an introjection, the inside of our parents' expectations, our cultural expectations, perhaps that we should have a higher degree or that we should go to the gym, whereas something like ice cream appeals to more id-like things, or something I want to eat now, something I want to enjoy, something that's going to be pleasurable. Now, the way these things are expressed in an individual is a complex affair of intrapsychic relationships. The way they're expressed online always function through the ego. So this is where you start to get some very careful decisions about how people are going to share, what they're going to share, and for what purpose. So for example, they're more likely to share things about their superego aspirations for themselves and less likely to share their sort of id-like aspirations. Now, some id aspirations are more socially acceptable to others, and they're going to appear online. Others, not so much. So the guy earlier who was talking about the sweat pads, less likely to show up on your Facebook profile as something that you've recently bought. However, your gym membership, that appeals to superego expectation, and also ego expectation about how you show up in the world, same kind of deal. That's more likely to go up there. So we persuade ourselves all the time, and we're not always honest with ourselves. We suggest to ourselves, we do all sorts of crazy stuff. So what we do is we identify, and we were talking about stories earlier on, we identify with things that fit the story that we have, the story that we would like ourselves to have, or the story in which we would like other people to see us living. Not always honest, but it's an ego need. How we show up in relation to others fortifies these stories, so we're likely to increase dependence on an ego identification. But we are divided. That's one vision. That's sort of, so these personas that you get online, this is one relationship under view to other people. So we need to justify our conflicting urges and desires. This is where ego defenses all come in. So you might buy the ice cream, and then you might have a justification for buying that ice cream. You might buy the gym membership to satisfy a superego need, then you may not go to the gym, and then you might come up with a justification about why you haven't gone to the gym. That's self-persuasion on a pretty large scale. What we show online social networks, ego-based, and the ego tries to synthesize all of these other needs. Doesn't always do a great job of it, but it is an ego function. And again, the key one, persuasion is both intrasubjective and intersubjective. So we do a job on ourselves, having conversations with ourselves about how we want to show up. Then we show up, and then we expose ourselves through this extension digitally for other people's opinions about how we show up. And then we interact with other people's egos. Just, if you can, in your mind, go back to the beginning and imagine that big black box that said process and the white bit that says content. Most of us, most of the time, tend to buy the ego stories of ourselves and others unless we want to think about it a little bit more deeply. So if I throw that beach ball around and people say the latest book they read, most people will kind of think, well, they probably read that book. If you thought about it, you'd think maybe they wouldn't be so honest about it. But the relationship that we have tends to be a relationship with ego, which we assume to be the whole picture when it's not the whole picture, and the more that we can understand and see how the ego mediates other stuff, the better we're going to understand people. So it's not so straightforward a question. And that's it. I don't know if there's any time for questions, possibly not. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
Sure.